She brought joy to my life. She was a beautiful soul. I just feel like she didn't deserve what she got.
She had been stabbed upwards of 80 times, and one of those almost severed her spinal cord. I mean, that's some anger and some hate.
Originally, it started out as arguments, but then they progressively got worse and ended up becoming physical.
It looked like it spiraled out of control, and she didn't have no control of what was going on.
All that resentment, all that rage, finally boiling over into a singular moment, that was their payback.
On January 13th, 2010, police in Conyers, Georgia receive an emergency call from a sheriff's deputy.
I was kind of winding down, getting ready to go home, and we get a call, maybe a homicide or a death, suspicious death in one of our local gated communities. The way the call came out, it didn't sound normal. So everybody from CID, let's all go. We all went at the same time. When I got to the neighborhood, there was a Rockdale County deputy there who told us that as he was driving, just happened to be driving through the neighborhood, I think he was serving civil papers, that a young girl came running out of a house or up to him saying that her mother was dead in the bathtub. I arrived on the scene, and there was already an ambulance there, and there were two twin girls, Taz and Jazz Whitehead, were sitting in the back of the ambulance.
Tasmia and Jasmia Whitehead are the twin teenage daughters of the victim, 34-year-old Nikki Whitehead. They both seem traumatized and are unable to answer any questions.
One of them, I believe it was Taz, as I introduced myself, she started biting herself on the arm. And I reached up and I'm like, hey, honey, stop. Don't do that. What are you doing? She told me when she gets nervous, she bites herself.
Sometimes people will self-harm. They'll cut, they'll burn themselves, they'll bite themselves because their emotional pain is so strong that they need something else to focus on. So they will inflict physical pain onto themselves so they don't feel that emotional turmoil.
Detectives decide to let the girls calm down, so they go to investigate the crime scene.
I walk in the house and I can see on the floor, there's blood all over the floor. Big stain, blood up all over the walls. We found the victim, Nikki Whitehead, in the bathtub. She had a nightgown on, there was water in the tub.
She has suffered multiple stab wounds to her head and upper body.
I've been in law enforcement 36 years, seen a lot, done a lot. SWAT, DEA, I've done all that. And this was perhaps one of the bloodiest scenes I'd ever seen. I close my eyes, I can still visualize the room quite clearly and where she was found.
The brutal nature of the crime makes police wonder, who could have hated Nikki enough to do this?
To me, this is really an up-close and personal crime. It really shows there's a lot of intimacy between the perpetrator and the victim.
Nikki Whitehead's life had been difficult from the moment she was born.
Nikki didn't have a great life. She was born in prison while her mother was serving a stint for prostitution and drug possession.
Nikki was sent to live with her grandmother in Decatur, Georgia, but it didn't feel like home.
Nikki felt like she was the black sheep of the family. She never understood why she was being raised by her grandmother and not by her mom. So that is something that it troubled her. It bothered her.
To be separated from a parent at such a young age, must have some type of impact on who you are as a person.
But as she grew up, Nikki didn't let it break her.
You had to know Nikki as a person because she brought so much joy, to my life. She was a very funny person. She was a jokester. She was creative. She was a very fun, loving person. She was beautiful, had such a beautiful spirit.
Nikki's grandmother did her best to prevent her from going down the same path as her mother. But in her teens, Nikki began to act out.
Nikki and I, we did things that we shouldn't have been doing at the age that we were doing it. You know, we were teenagers.
All she really wanted was her mother's love, and she never got that. Instead, Nikki started looking for love in all the wrong places, hanging with the wrong crowd, with the wrong men. Nikki's grandmother, Della, tried to discipline her, and it didn't go over well. At the age of 16, she ended up moving out of her grandmother's home. She was bouncing around from place to place.
Then, at 17, Nikki fell in love with an older man.
Nikki and I would venture out to his club, not knowing that he was the owner of the club. He had interest in Nikki. They started dating. Shortly, it didn't take any time for Nikki to become pregnant.
It looked like Nikki was going to have a family of her own, but her boyfriend had different plans.
She told the father that she was pregnant, and he basically blew her off and didn't want anything to do with her. And that was when she also found out that he was married.
Nikki decided to go through with the pregnancy anyway.
In 1993, when she was only 18, Nikki gave birth to two beautiful girls, Tasmia and Jasmia.
We didn't know that she was carrying a set of twins. One was a split image of Nikki, and one was a split image of him.
Being a teen mother was difficult, especially with twins. So Nikki moved back in with her grandmother, Della.
Since Della raised Nikki, she knew that would be the perfect person to help her raise her twins.
Nikki did everything she could to try to provide for the kids. She got her cosmetology license and she began to do hair, but most of the actual daily child care responsibilities fell on her grandmother because she was working so much.
Over time, the stress and responsibility became more than Nikki could handle.
Nikki really felt that she missed out on doing the things that a young adult would do. On the one hand, she has these two children that she needs to raise and be a mom, but on the other hand, she herself wants to enjoy life, and that really put her in a very difficult position.
Knowing that Della would take care of the twins, Nikki started living the fast life again. She began hanging out and drinking.
That meant the twins didn't get to spend much time with Nikki. But Della worked hard to try to make sure they grew up right.
Thanks to Della, the girls began to thrive. They were very well behaved and excellent students.
You had one that liked to play the piano. You had the other one that was a dancer. They was very mannerable, respectful. At the time, they were still saying yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. Yes, sir, and no, sir. So, that speaks volume.
The twins didn't really view Nikki as an authority figure because she hadn't really been that way to them up until this point. Instead, she was like the fun, loving older sister.
Nikki had started off kind of rough. She was a young mom, and she still wanted to party like most young people want to do that are thrown into a situation where now I got to be an adult all of a sudden. But, over the 15, 16 years of her daughters, she had finally realized she wanted to straighten herself out.
As she got older, she really wanted to be more of a mother figure in the girls' lives.
So did her new boyfriend, a long-haul trucker named Robert.
He was 30 years older than she was, but I think Nikki thought that this provided her the stability that she needed in her life. Robert really cared about Nikki's daughters, and he really wanted to be a father in their lives. And so he suggested that they move in together.
The transition from being a fun older sister to a disciplinarian would be tough, however.
And what Nikki was trying to teach and preach to them, do as I say and not as I do. And I don't think the kids took heed to that.
But Nikki was determined to give the girls a good, stable life.
For Jazz and Taz to be finally reunited with their mom, and then for them to have the rug pulled out from under them and find her murdered, there are no words. It's completely devastating.
After Nikki Whitehead's teenage twin daughters discover her stabbed to death in their home, the girls are taken to safety as investigators search the house for evidence. In the living room, they find a broken vase with blood on it, but knife wounds on Nikki's body indicate that she was stabbed to death.
There was not blood seeping from the wounds in the tub, so we were able to surmise that the majority of her wounds had occurred outside and that she'd done most of her bleeding before she was put into the tub.
I've been involved in some shootings and things that were pretty bad, but this was, it was just, there's blood all over the house. In the carpet, all through the bedroom.
The bedroom was, that's where it took place. You know, it was like she was dragged. Like you could see the body on the carpet where she was, you know, she was dragged into the bathtub. So yeah, it was something that it was out of a movie.
The field crew was working on checking every garbage can, every drain pipe, looking for a murder weapon. We checked the house. And of course, like any house, the house had numerous knives in it, so we had to collect them and test each one for blood.
There was no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. And the garage was down and locked, the back door standing open as if somebody went from the inside out the back door.
And there, bloody prints left by bare feet.
The police saw a trail of blood going to the neighbor's house. So now the police must interview the neighbor as a potential suspect.
I find blood on the door frame. I'm like, okay. So bang on the door, bang on the door. A gentleman answers the door. I tell him who we are, why we're there, and he kind of already knew what was going on. I'm like, hey, we've got blood on your door right here.
He told us that morning he had been listening to a popular Atlanta radio station and that he did hear somebody ring his doorbell and heard screaming, but that he just didn't respond to it. We surmised that the bare feet leading out had been Nikki and that at one point she had escaped, made it to the neighbor's house seeking help, and that someone had drug her back into the house.
Police think the sounds the neighbor ignored may have been Nikki's last desperate cries for help.
Asked him why he didn't open the door, he didn't answer. Pretty much just said it wasn't his business. He didn't want to be bothered. And that's sad, because, you know, if he had called 911, she very well could be here today.
When detectives are finished at the crime scene, they return to the precinct where Rockdale County sheriffs have taken Nikki's twins.
So I have the girls in an interview room, asking them what had happened and how they found their mom, and asked them to start from the beginning. They said they left for school that morning at around 7:30 in the morning.
Can you tell me what happened when you got home today?
I just called back to the bus. I noticed that gate was open. So I was like, why the gate open?
And you walked in and what happened?
I went to the kitchen and put my stuff down. And I went to her room. And so I seen the blood all in there on the floor. And I went in there and I seen her.
What room is she in?
In her room.
In her room? she on the floor, on the
She
bed,
was in the
in the
bathtub.
bathtub?
And they found their mother in the tub and then ran out, saw the sheriff, and flagged the sheriff down.
When I asked the girls who they thought may have hurt their mother, they said maybe Joe or Robert. These are two men that their mother dated both of them and talked with them a lot. Robert was the actual live-in boyfriend. They lived at Robert's house. This was his house that it happened at.
Nikki's daughters revealed to police that she'd been cheating on Robert with a man named Joe.
When the twins told us about the two boyfriends, that made both of those men possible suspects because it gave both of them possible motive.
Does Robert know about these other guys that your mom sees?
Probably not. Like they stay together, but like when she talk about him and other people, she say my friend Robert. He like 60-something. He like a sugar daddy.
Things were good between Nikki and Robert for a while, but unfortunately, as a truck driver, Robert wasn't there all the time, and Nikki was alone and lonely.
In many ways, Nikki found it difficult to have a stable life. She always ran from stability. She was dating a man who was a trucker, who was in and out of her life. Again, very unavailable emotionally because he wasn't there, which is really what her mindset was. But then she has this other guy.
Robert was many years older. Joe was more Nikki, the victim's age.
If Nikki cheated on Robert, it's possible Robert flew into a murderous rage when he discovered what was going on.
When's the last time you saw Robert?
Yesterday he left. He came in on Sunday. He stayed for a day. He left.
We contacted the company that he worked for, and they began getting us the truck's GPS information. Robert returned to Conyers immediately. He explained his relationship with Nikki was that he expected her to be faithful to him when he was in town. He understood that there was a big age difference and that she was going to see other guys and party while he was gone, but he felt like she had disrespected him.
Robert swears he could never hurt Nikki, and he has an alibi. He was hundreds of miles away on a job when the killing happened, which GPS records confirm.
He explained that he had a great relationship with Nikki, a great relationship with the twins. When we asked him if he suspected of anybody, he could not name anybody that he would suspect of the murder.
So, if Robert didn't kill Nikki, maybe it was his rival, Joe.
There's a second boyfriend, then that brings up motive. So we sent detectives out to find Joe.
After the stabbing death of Nikki Whitehead, Nikki's twin daughters tell police their mother was having an affair with a man named Joe, and she'd spoken with him the night before she died.
The only thing was she was just drunk last night. She was loud but arguing with Joe.
She was telling Joe not to come out there and not to come to her house, and that it had been a very angry argument. So we sent detectives out to find Joe. Joe's a barber in Atlanta, and they located the barbershop. There were several men hanging around out front, and they approached them and told them they were looking for Joe. So they got straight to the point and told them that Nikki had been murdered, and they were looking to notify Joe.
Joe was absolutely devastated. He was visibly upset, and he had no idea that any of this had happened to Nikki.
He seemed to be truly shocked and upset that somebody he'd been having a relationship with was dead. When we're telling him what happened, it was very honest. He didn't seem to be hiding anything.
Joe admits that he and Nikki argued on the phone that night after she left his house, but not because he was jealous.
Joe broke things off with Nikki because he started seeing someone else, and it was getting pretty serious. But he also knew that Nikki also had someone else. She had Robert. And nothing was really going to happen with their relationship in light of those circumstances.
We collected the surveillance video from his condominium, and we did in fact see Nikki come and go. And the times that Nikki came and left were consistent with what he said. He allowed us to examine his body, his hand, his arms. We knew from the crime scene that Nikki fought for her life, and we could see from the crime scene that it was not, somebody was toting some injuries from the fight, and he had no injuries. Joe was very emphatic that he wanted to cooperate with the investigation, and when we offered a polygraph test, he consented right away. The polygraphist indicated that Joe had no deception in his test.
With their suspects cleared, investigators interviewed Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah again to go over the timeline of that day one more time. They claimed their mother was drunk and stoned that morning.
They told us that when they woke up for school, they were late, and they went to tell their mother they were leaving, and the mother's door was closed, and they knocked on the door, and Nikki didn't respond, and so they went ahead and left for school.
They did miss the bus, but they walked to school, and that's about a 2-mile trip from their house. It's a long way to walk, but they did say they made it to school in time.
The twins say they don't know of anyone else who'd want to hurt their mother. But detectives noticed something odd about their behavior.
They had not removed their coats, they hadn't removed their gloves, and this was a warm environment. Even though it was January, the inside was warm, and so that was non-normal behavior. So we asked them to remove their coats and their gloves, and we noticed that they had bites and bruises and scratches.
I'd asked them what happened. They said they got in a fight with each other, which just seemed really strange to me, knowing that from the crime scene, it was pretty violent. And for them to have these marks on them, it just didn't sit well with me.
I separated the twins and interviewed them separately and used all of the normal tactics of, well, you're not telling me what they're telling me, and these twins didn't waver at all. They stuck to their story and didn't waver.
Despite their suspicions, police don't have any evidence to hold the girls and release them into their grandmother's care. The next day, the medical examiner issues the gruesome results of Nikki's autopsy.
They discovered blunt force trauma to the head. This is not a surprise considering the police found a broken vase on the crime scene. They also found more than 80 stab wounds to Nikki's body.
One of those almost severed her spinal cord. I mean, that's some anger and some hate. That's some revenge and payback going on right there to stab somebody that much.
More significantly, there is one thing the medical examiner didn't find.
Autopsy also showed, contrary to what the twins had said, that she didn't have any alcohol or marijuana in her system.
That was inconsistent, and that was our first indication of deceit from the girls. This was, okay, you're not telling us the truth, and let's investigate this.
Police investigating the killing of Nikki Whitehead ask her loved ones about her relationship with their twin daughters. They discover it was much worse than they were led to believe.
When we interviewed Nikki's best friend, Yucca, Yucca explained that there had been lots of problems between the twins and Nikki.
But they was just disrespecting her so badly. And they was, I guess, she couldn't control them.
We did find out that the girls were known for skipping school when they lived with their grandmother. And when Nikki got custody of them back, they weren't allowed to do that. And they didn't like that. They liked the freedom they had.
Also, they didn't really want to listen to Nikki because they thought Nikki was hypocritical. Because here Nikki was telling them how to live their lives, and Nikki herself had had such a tumultuous existence. Who was she? Was she the moral pillar that could tell them what to do? So as a role model, I think she really struggled to have the moral high ground.
When Taz and Jazz started to rebel against Nikki, originally it started out as arguments, but then they progressively got worse and ended up becoming physical. In June of 2008, Nikki actually called 911 because her daughters jumped her and dragged her across the floor because she was trying to limit their cell phone usage.
When did they hit you? Just now. As soon as she put her hands on me, I went on the call. They keep on hitting me. Then, I might retaliate and have to put my hands on them, And it just be a big mess. So I'm just trying to prevent maybe something bigger happening.
Up until that point, Nikki hadn't done anything about the abuse because she didn't want anyone to know.
In the Black community, it's not often that you see a child abusing a parent. Nikki was embarrassed that she had lost control of her daughters to the point where they were the ones that were abusing her.
These girls were very troubled, and their mother knew it. But in some way, she saw it as her own failing if she couldn't raise them. If someone else was raising them, that she was deficient in some way. But also, a mother has maternal instincts, and those instincts are very strong. So Nikki was not going to give up on those kids, no matter what.
Despite Nikki's efforts, things only got worse. A few days before she was killed, she reached out to her best friend, Yucca Harris, with a disturbing and prophetic warning.
She called me, and she had told me that the girls were just really acting, behaving badly, and she felt like if anything happened to her, the kids did it. It was almost like I didn't believe Nikki, because I'm like, wait a minute, not, the twins, because they never projected that energy or, they never showed that side, what Nikki was portraying to me over the phone.
Yucca told us that Nikki was so scared that she replaced the lock on her bedroom so that she had a deadbolt from inside because she was that fearful of the twins.
In light of this new information, detectives take a closer look at the twins' whereabouts at the time of the slaying. They start by following the path the girls say they took to school.
The detectives that were canvassing on foot made it about a mile away to a gas station. At that gas station was one of the locations that we noticed had surveillance video. On that surveillance video, we were able to see that the two girls had, in fact, walked up at 10 o'clock.
Video from the school shows they arrived there at 10:15, 3 hours later than they claimed. That would have given them enough time to kill their mother.
One interesting thing they did that we noted was the first trash can they came to, one of the twins walked up and discarded something into that trash can. We surmised that might have been the knife, but by the time we actually got to that point, the dumpsters had already been taken to the landfills.
Another search of the house provides more incriminating evidence.
We found shoes that were in the closet that had blood on the outside of them. There was no reason those shoes would have blood on them unless they had been in the room at the time blood occurred. In one of the shoes, we found a tissue. In that tissue was hair, clumps of hair that had been pulled from the head.
Also, what we found during our investigation search of the girls' rooms, we found a journal. There was a lot of negative things in there about their mom, a lot of hatred toward their mom.
They had written back and forth, sort of like you would text nowadays. They had written back and forth to each other that if we're going to get out of here, we got to get rid of her. And the other one responded, yeah, we've got to get rid of her ASAP.
The evidence seems to be stacking up against Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead. After a short investigation, Conyers police have reason to believe the teens are responsible for the brutal stabbing death of their mother, Nikki.
The twins' alibi didn't add up. There were many holes in their stories.
They both had injuries on their arms. These injuries were bite marks and scratches. They both had journal entries to each other where they discussed killing their mother. They both had blood-stained shoes in their closets.
But these are teen girls whose lives have been tumultuous from the start. So detectives wait to make any arrests until the crime lab completes its analysis of the samples collected at the crime scene. Until then, the girls still need care.
After Nikki's murder, the girls were alone. They didn't have their mother, they didn't have their father. They went back to their grandmother, but it wasn't the same.
Jazz and Taz, their lives were filled with chaos. In many ways, they tried to cling back to some sense of normalcy by going back to school and trying to live a normal life.
To those unaware of what's going on, the twins seem to be normal teenagers working through the loss of their mother. A few weeks later, the results from the crime scene come back.
We were able to find the twins' DNA mixed in with Nikki's DNA on the blood splatter on the wall. And there could be no explanation other than they were there and they were injured.
During the interview with the twins, Taz was biting her arm a lot, and I had to make her stop. There were bite marks on her arm that were very similar, if not matched, Nikki, which shows you their mom wasn't fighting for her life that night. The lead detectives finally decided we have enough to present to the DA, and the DA agreed. Now we have enough to move forward and get justice for Nikki.
On May 21st, 2010, detectives arrest Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah for the murder of their mother. One of the girls was arrested at Della's home. The other was arrested at her high school in front of all the other students. The girls were really angry when they were arrested, and they kept telling the arresting officers that they needed to go and find their mother's real killer.
As prosecutors prepare for trial, the DNA evidence presents a unique challenge to them.
As identical twins, Taz and Jazz had the same DNA, and so the prosecution wasn't clear as to which twin actually committed the murder, or if both of them did it together.
Sometimes when you have twins, the bond is so strong that one twin will go along with what the other twin wants. And very often you'll see that one of them is more aggressive and one is more passive. But when it came together, it's almost as if the sum of the parts was greater than the whole. And that was a powder keg that exploded.
Prosecutors decide they will try the 16-year-old suspects as adults because of the seriousness of the crime. That could mean life sentences for Jazz and Taz if they're convicted.
This was a situation where they were clearly, very aggressively going after Mom, and it seemed like they wanted her dead, and they wanted her dead 10 times over.
The case against 16-year-old sisters Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah Whitehead takes almost 3 years to make it to court. But in early 2013, a date is finally set for the twins to stand trial as adults for the killing of their mother, Nikki Whitehead.
With the unsurmountable amount of evidence against them, the twins both know they're facing a potential life sentence if a jury convicts them. So their defense attorneys offer to provide prosecutors with a confession in exchange for a plea to lessen the charge and reduce their sentences. Prosecutors agreed to let the girls plead to voluntary manslaughter if they confess on camera in front of the DA. But their sentences won't be determined until after they hear the twins' entire story.
The district attorney interviews the twins separately, but their stories are identical.
Jazz and Taz claim that their mother had been aggressive with them and angry from the night before, and that it continued into the morning.
She was in there, as soon as she saw us, she starts cursing and stuff. I think she was mad about us being late to school and stuff. And then she almost like slung the pot like that. And then Jazz kind of put up a mama like that, and after that, I'm not really sure. I'm gonna be clear to say I don't remember everything. It comes in snatches, I'll say. We're fist fighting or whatever. My sister are really fighting. They're fighting and punching each other, things like that. She's on top of my sister, choking her. I can't even tell you what life is at this point. But she choking Tad, and I pick up a base.
Both girls say they believed Nikki was going to kill them if they didn't kill her first.
My state of mind, I believe at the time was defend yourself. It wasn't like it was a fight on the street. It was more of a fight till somebody died.
They had her there against a wall, and eventually one of the knife wounds went into her neck, into her spine, and that's what caused her to collapse.
Authorities aren't convinced the twins are being entirely truthful.
Their confessions were self-centered, made them look as good as you can look in a murder scene, and put some of the culpability on to Nikki.
Jazz and Taz claim that Mom was coming home drunk and high on drugs as probably a way to justify their actions. But what we know from the toxicology and the autopsy is that there was nothing found in her system.
I think the girl's defense was trying to tear my girlfriend down. They was gonna try to tear her to pieces to make her seem as if she was just this awful, evil person.
Regardless of how the fight began, it ended with Nikki dead.
Nikki knew at some point during the attack that she was in the fight for her life, and she did everything she could to stay alive. And we know from the pattern of injuries on her body that she fought literally to the death with every ounce of strength that she had. This was not a case where Jazz stabbed her mom and then they quickly retreated. This is something that continued even to the point where Mom escaped and they dragged her back to finish the job. There's a particular brutality and rage in this crime.
To see your mother die in her own blood, and they picked that body up and put her inside the bathtub and went about their normal day at school, tells me something about these two young ladies. They just didn't care. They just didn't care at all.
It sounds a little dramatic to say, but I said it then, and I'll say it today. Just being with them, you just had a sense of evil in these two girls. They were very manipulative and putting on a show, and you could just feel that there was no real remorse there.
The court agrees to let the girls plead guilty to manslaughter, but rejects the defense's request for 10-year sentences.
The prosecutor was like, okay, we can give voluntary manslaughter, but we don't know if it's gonna be 10 years. And then they heard Taz and Jazz's statements, and they were like, hell no, they ain't getting 10 years. They received 30 years with the possibility of parole. At sentencing, Jazz apologized for what happened to her mother. Taz did not.
They should have got more time than what they got, I think. I just feel like that was not enough.
The girls are serving their time in separate facilities in Georgia. If they're not granted parole, they would not be released until 2040 when they're 46 years old.
A lot of people have looked at this case, and one of the things that they struggle with is to find a real motive. In other words, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of kids who don't get along with their mother. But what about these kids caused them to be over the edge to kill their mother?
On December 22nd, 1999, William Patrick Fife was arrested in Barrie, Ontario. For the investigators who had been chasing answers across Quebec, the arrest was not the end of the story. It was the moment the story finally began to make sense. For more than a week, police had been working around the murder of Mary Elizabeth Glenn, a woman found dead inside her home in Baie d'Urf on December 15th. Her death was not an isolated tragedy. It was the latest in a sequence of killings that had appeared, one after another, across different communities. For women. For separate locations. For separate crime scenes. And yet, beneath the differences, investigators were beginning to see something that was difficult to ignore. A pattern. The kind of pattern that becomes visible only after someone has already been hurt. The kind that seems obvious in retrospect, but almost impossible to see while the pieces are still scattered across different police files, different jurisdictions, different years. For years, these deaths had existed as separate stories. Different women. Different homes. Different dates. Different investigators. Different unanswered questions. Then, in the autumn of 1999, the killings came closer together. Anna Yarnold was killed in Senneville in October. Monique Gaudreau was killed in St. Agathe later that month. Teresa Shanahan was killed in Laval in November. And then came Mary Elizabeth Glenn. December 15th, 1999. Baie d'Urf. By then, investigators were no longer looking at a single murder. They were looking at the possibility that someone had been moving through Quebec for years, entering the lives of women who could never have imagined that a familiar doorway, a routine visit, or an apparently ordinary encounter could become the last moment of their lives. And then there was a name. William Patrick Fife. A man whose occupation could place him inside other people's homes. A man who, according to the investigation that followed, would become connected not only to the murders of 1999, but to older killings reaching back decades. The distance between those years is almost difficult to comprehend. 1979, 1980, 1981, 1982, 1983, 20 years. 2 decades in which life continued. Children grew older. Families moved. Homes changed hands. Neighborhoods changed. People married, worked, retired, celebrated birthdays, buried relatives, paid bills, went shopping, opened their front doors, and went to sleep believing that tomorrow would arrive, just like any other day. But somewhere inside police files, several women's deaths remained unresolved. Their names did not disappear. They waited, and eventually, those files would begin to point toward the same man. That is what makes the case of William Patrick Fife so disturbing. Not simply the number of women connected to his name, not simply the years involved, but the possibility that the truth had been sitting in fragments for years, waiting for investigators to realize that the fragments belonged to the same picture. Imagine the investigators in late 1999. They are not looking at history yet. They are looking at the most recent victim. They have a dead woman. They have a home that should have been safe. They have questions. Who had been there? Who knew her? Who had a reason to enter the house? Who could have approached without immediately raising suspicion? And, perhaps most importantly, was this murder connected to the others? That last question changes everything. Because if the answer is no, investigators are dealing with one killer. If the answer is yes, they may be dealing with someone who has already killed before, and perhaps someone who will kill again. The murder of Teresa Shanahan offered one of the clues that would later become particularly significant. Investigators discovered that a person resembling Fife had appeared at an ATM using Shanahan's bank card. It was not a complete answer. A person appearing on a surveillance recording is not, by itself, a murder conviction. But investigations rarely turn on one clue alone. They turn on accumulation. One detail connects to another. One statement raises another question. One old file suddenly looks different when placed beside a new one. And somewhere in that process, suspicion begins to acquire a shape. Fife's story had begun long before the police came for him in December 1999. According to the case history, murders began being attributed to him as far back as 1979. The first names associated with that period include Suzanne Marie Bernier and Nicole Raymond. Then, in March 1981, Hazel Scatolin, 52 years old, was found dead in her apartment in Mont Royal. She had been attacked with a knife. At the time, there was no public narrative connecting her death to a man who would eventually become one of the most notorious murder suspects in Quebec. There was only a woman who was dead, a family left without answers, a police investigation trying to reconstruct the final hours of a life, and a question that would remain unanswered for years. Who killed Hazel Scatolin? Then came 1987. Louise Poupard LeBlanc. Then 1989. Pauline Laplante. Both women were later associated with Fife through his statements and the broader investigation, but neither murder became one of the 5 killings for which he was ultimately convicted. That distinction matters, because true crime stories have a dangerous tendency to turn suspicion into certainty. A confession can become a headline can become a number, and a number can become mythology. But a courtroom operates differently. There is what investigators believe. There is what a suspect claims. There is what evidence suggests. And then there is what can actually be proven beyond the required legal standard. In Fife's case, those categories did not perfectly overlap. He eventually admitted involvement in 9 killings, according to the case history, while the actual number of victims associated with him has remained the subject of dispute. What can be stated with greater certainty is that he was convicted of 5 murders. 5 women. 5 lives. 5 families. 5 stories that ended in violence, while the man responsible eventually stood before a court and received a life sentence. But in December 1999, none of that had happened yet. At that moment, the police were still trying to understand what they were looking at, and the man they would eventually arrest was still free. Somewhere outside the crime scene, somewhere beyond the police perimeter, somewhere in the ordinary world where people went about their final week before Christmas. December has a particular way of making tragedy feel even more jarring. The calendar moves toward a season associated with family, gathering, tradition, and memory. Homes are prepared for holidays. People make plans. Messages are exchanged. But for Mary Elizabeth Glenn's family, December 1999 would become permanently associated with loss. Her death on December 15th was the 4th killing in a sequence that had unfolded over only a few months. And investigators had a reason to be concerned. If the same person was responsible for these deaths, then the killer had not stopped. The question was no longer simply, who killed Mary Glenn? It was becoming, who has been doing this? That is a very different question. It forces investigators to look backward, to compare, to reopen, to examine old evidence that may once have seemed insignificant, to search for similarities between victims who may never have known one another, to ask whether the killer had a preferred method of approach, whether he had a particular reason for choosing certain women, whether he gained access through trust, whether his occupation provided him with opportunities that an ordinary stranger would never have had, and perhaps most unsettling of all, whether the killer had been hiding in plain sight. Fife had worked in repair and maintenance. That kind of work can create access. A repairman does not necessarily look out of place when standing at a stranger's door. He may have a reason to be there, a practical reason, a professional reason, a reason that can lower someone's guard. There is nothing inherently sinister about the work itself. That is precisely what makes the possibility so unsettling. Danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives with an explanation. Sometimes it arrives with a name. Sometimes it arrives because the person standing at the door appears to have a legitimate reason for being there. And when that explanation is accepted, the door opens. The significance of that possibility would become clearer as investigators connected Fife to the deaths. But the most haunting part of the story is not the arrest. It is what came before it. The years when no one knew. The years when the victims existed in separate cases. The years when families had to live with uncertainty. Imagine carrying a question for 18 years, or 10, or 5. There is no clean ending to an unsolved murder. There is no final chapter. Instead, there is a blank space. A family member may remember a voice on the telephone, a photograph on a shelf, a coat still hanging where it was left, a birthday that arrives every year, an anniversary that no longer means celebration, and beneath all of it, the same question: who did this? For some families, the answer would eventually come, but it would not bring back what had been taken. That is an important distinction in this story. Solving a murder is not the same thing as undoing it. An arrest cannot reverse time. A confession cannot restore a life. A conviction cannot erase a family's memory of the day everything changed. Justice can establish responsibility. It can impose punishment. It can close a legal case. But it cannot make the victim walk back through the door. By the time Fife was arrested in Barrie, investigators were beginning to understand that they might have been dealing with a much larger story than the murder of one woman. The investigation expanded. Police from different jurisdictions began examining unsolved murders for similarities. The boundaries between individual cases began to blur. A death in one community could no longer be viewed entirely on its own. A woman killed years earlier could suddenly become relevant. A name buried inside an old file could suddenly matter. A detail that once seemed meaningless could become a link. This is where a murder investigation can become something larger than a search for one offender. It becomes a reconstruction of history. And history is difficult to reconstruct. Evidence disappears. Memories change. People die. Documents become old. Places are renovated or demolished. Technology evolves. Investigative techniques that did not exist years earlier become available. And the people who originally worked a case may have moved on. Yet the dead remain at the center of the investigation. Their names remain. Their photographs remain. Their families remain. And the question remains: who killed them? For William Patrick Fife, the answer would eventually lead to a courtroom. But before that happened, investigators had to build a bridge across 20 years. From 1979 to 1999. From Suzanne Marie Bernier and Nicole Raymond to Hazel Scatolin. From Hazel Scatolin to Louise Poupart-LeBlanc. From Louise Poupart-LeBlanc to Pauline LaPlante. From those earlier cases to the 4 women killed in 1999. Anna Yarnold, Monique Gaudreau, Teresa Shanahan, Mary Elizabeth Glenn. Different women. Different places. Different years. But one name would eventually sit at the center of the investigation: William Patrick Fife. And on December 22, 1999, that name was no longer simply part of a police investigation. Fife was in custody. The man investigators believed could connect the cases was no longer somewhere beyond their reach. But an arrest is only the beginning. Now came the harder questions. What exactly had he done? How many women had crossed his path? Which murders could actually be proven? Which deaths could be linked to him through physical evidence, witness accounts, financial records, statements, or other investigative findings? And what had happened during all those years between the first suspected killings and the final series of murders? Because if Fife was responsible for the killings attributed to him, then the timeline tells a disturbing story. It suggests not one terrible moment, not one sudden act, but a pattern stretching across years, a pattern in which violence appeared, disappeared, and then appeared again. That gap matters. It forces us to confront something uncomfortable about the way we imagine serial killers. We often picture a monster constantly moving toward his next victim. But real cases can be less linear. There can be years between crimes. There can be periods when nothing is publicly known. There can be ordinary life between extraordinary acts of violence. A person can go to work, talk to people, buy groceries, repair a house, return home. And somewhere inside the same person can exist a capacity for violence that those around him may never see. That contrast is one of the most disturbing elements of the Fife case. The terrifying figure in the police file and the ordinary man moving through everyday life can be the same person. There is no dramatic transformation required, no visible warning, no cinematic moment when the darkness suddenly appears. That is not how danger necessarily works. Sometimes it is hidden inside routine. And perhaps that is why this case continued to resonate, because the women at the center of it were not characters in a horror story. They were people. They had histories. They had relationships. They had ordinary days. They had futures that were supposed to continue. Their lives cannot be reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. Yet their deaths are what brought investigators together. And their deaths are what eventually brought Fife before the court. On September 21st, 2001, William Patrick Fife was convicted and received a life sentence. By then, the investigation had traveled across decades. The 5 murders for which he was convicted represented only part of the broader story surrounding his name. Other killings had been attributed to him through his own statements and investigative findings, but they did not all carry the same legal status. That distinction would remain important, because the final number is not the most important thing. 9, 5, or any other number suggested by later accounts. Behind every number is a person, and behind every person is a family that once expected that person to come home. That is where the story begins. Not with a monster, not with a headline, not even with an arrest. It begins with women whose lives were interrupted, families left searching for answers, and investigators who spent years trying to understand whether apparently separate tragedies were actually connected. It begins in the shadows of unresolved cases. It moves through 2 decades of uncertainty, and it reaches a winter week in 1999, when 4 recent murders forced investigators to ask whether they were looking at a single killer. 7 days after Mary Elizabeth Glenn was killed, they arrested William Patrick Fife. But the arrest did not explain everything. It opened the door to something much larger. Because when investigators began looking backward, they did not find an empty timeline. They found names. They found old cases. They found women whose deaths had never received the answers their families deserved. And they found a trail that appeared to stretch much farther back than anyone had initially realized. 20 years earlier, somewhere in Quebec, a series of lives had begun to intersect with the story of William Patrick Fife. And by the time police finally caught up with him, the question was no longer whether one woman had been murdered. The question was how many women had been waiting, for years, for someone to finally connect the pieces. This is the story of that search. The story of the victims, whose names must come before the man who killed them. The story of an investigation that reached backward through time. And the story of what happened when the past finally caught up with William Patrick Fife. On the morning after William Patrick Fife was taken into custody, the world had not changed. The streets were still there. The houses were still standing. Cars still moved through the cold December air. People still went to work. Christmas was only days away. And somewhere in Quebec, families were still trying to understand how a woman could leave one day and never come home. But for investigators, something had changed. A name had finally been attached to a series of questions that had haunted police departments for years. William Patrick Fife. For the first time, investigators could look at the murders from a different direction. Instead of asking whether a killer might still be somewhere out there, they could ask what the killer had already done. That difference is enormous. When a murderer is unidentified, every possibility remains open. The suspect could be a stranger, a neighbor, a former partner, a burglar, someone passing through town, someone who knew the victim, someone who had no obvious connection to her at all. But once investigators have a suspect, the investigation becomes a reconstruction. They begin taking apart the suspect's life. Where did he live? Where did he work? Who did he know? Where had he been? What opportunities had he had? And perhaps most importantly, how far back could his connection to violence be traced? Far beyond the winter of 1999. Far beyond the 4 women killed that year. The trail, according to the case history, reached back to 1979. 20 years. 2 decades separating the beginning of the suspected killing pattern from the arrest that finally brought Fife into custody. 20 years is long enough for almost anything to change. A child can become an adult. A teenager can become a parent. A neighborhood can change completely. A house can be sold several times. A police officer can retire. A witness can forget. A family can learn how to live with grief without ever learning the truth. And an unsolved murder can slowly become part of the landscape. Not because it becomes less painful. Because people have no choice but to continue living. That is one of the cruelest things about an unresolved murder. The victim's life stops. Everyone else's does not. The calendar continues. Birthdays arrive. Holidays come and go. Children grow older. Photographs become older photographs. The person who is missing remains the same age in the memories of those who loved them. But the rest of the world keeps moving. For the families connected to the murders, later attributed to Fife, the passage of time did not necessarily bring closure. It simply created distance between the crime and the investigation. And distance can make an investigation harder. Memories fade. Evidence becomes harder to interpret. People who once remembered small details may no longer remember them clearly. A conversation that seemed insignificant in 1981 may have been forgotten by 1991. A face seen briefly may have become impossible to describe accurately. A vehicle may have disappeared. A building may have changed. Even the investigators themselves may have changed. Yet the unanswered question remained. Who killed her? In March 1981, that question belonged to the family of Hazel Scatolin. Hazel was 52 years old. On March 25th, she was found dead in her apartment in Mont Royal. She had been attacked with a knife. There is a particular cruelty in the idea of a murder taking place inside someone's home. A home is supposed to be the place where the outside world stops. The door closes. The locks turn. The familiar surroundings create a sense of control. The same walls surround you every night. The same hallway. The same rooms. The same ordinary objects. A home is not supposed to become the final scene of someone's life. But for Hazel Scatolin, that is what happened. At the time, investigators did not have the benefit of hindsight. They could not look at her death and say, this is part of something that will eventually span 20 years. They were dealing with one murder, one woman, one apartment, one family waiting for answers. The connection to Fife would emerge only much later. That is one of the recurring patterns in this case. The meaning of an event changed after another event occurred. A murder that once appeared isolated could later become part of a larger pattern. A detail that once seemed ordinary could later become important. A name that once meant nothing could eventually become central to an investigation. But there was no guarantee that anyone would see the connection. That is what makes investigations involving multiple jurisdictions so difficult. The same killer does not necessarily operate in one neighborhood. He may cross municipal boundaries. He may cross police jurisdictions. He may choose victims who appear unrelated. He may wait months or years between attacks. And every separation creates another opportunity for the pattern to remain hidden. That is exactly what makes the year 1999 so important. Something changed. The murders began occurring closer together. Anna Yarnold was killed in Senneville in October. Monique Gaudreau was killed in St. Agathe later that month. Teresa Shanahan was killed in Laval in November. Then, on December 15th, Mary Elizabeth Glenn was killed in Baie-d'Urf. 4 women. For locations, a matter of weeks. Suddenly, the possibility of a common offender became much harder to ignore. The geography alone was unsettling. Senneville, St. Agathe, Laval, Baie-d'Urf. Different communities, different circumstances, but investigators were looking for the invisible line connecting them. Was there one? Or were they seeing something that wasn't there? Investigators have to be careful with patterns. Once the possibility of a serial offender enters an investigation, every similarity can suddenly look meaningful. But similarities can be deceptive. People can be killed in similar ways by completely unrelated offenders. Different crimes can share superficial characteristics. The challenge is determining whether the similarities are coincidental or whether they point toward the same person. That requires evidence. It requires patience. And it requires investigators to resist the temptation to force the pieces together simply because they appear to fit. In the case of Teresa Shanahan, however, investigators found a particularly intriguing lead. Someone resembling Fife appeared at an ATM using Shanahan's bank card. That did not, by itself, tell investigators everything. But it raised a question. Why would someone resembling Fife have access to the victim's card? And if that person was Fife, how did he obtain it? Questions create pressure inside an investigation. One question leads to another. Where was Fife at the time? Did he know Shanahan? Had he been in Laval? Could anyone place him there? Was there another explanation? And what about the other murders? the investigation began to widen. By December, the murder of Mary Elizabeth Glenn added another piece to the puzzle. She was killed in Baie-d'Urf on December 15th. This was no longer merely an old case. This was immediate, recent, and potentially connected to a series that appeared to be accelerating. For investigators, time mattered. If the same person was responsible, there was a possibility that he might strike again. And that meant the pressure was no longer only about solving past murders. It was about preventing another one. 7 days later, on December 22nd, William Patrick Fife was arrested in Barrie, Ontario. The location is important because it shows how quickly the investigation had moved beyond the immediate crime scene. Fife was not simply waiting inside the neighborhood where Mary Glenn had been killed. He was in another province, and investigators had to find him. They did. The arrest brought a dramatic shift in the case. But there was still an enormous amount that investigators did not know. Who exactly was William Patrick Fife? What had brought him into the lives of these women? How many times had he crossed paths with victims whose names investigators had not yet connected to him? And how long had the pattern been continuing? These questions would send investigators backward. The deeper they looked, the older the trail became. The first suspected murders associated with Fife dated back to 1979. 2 names emerged from that period: Suzanne Marie Bernier, Nicole Raymond, then Hazel Scatolin in 1981, then Louise Poupart-LeBlanc in 1987, then Pauline LaPlante in 1989, then the 4 women of 1999. The names formed a disturbing sequence, but it is important not to turn that sequence into something it was not. Not every one of those deaths resulted in a conviction against Fife. Some were connected to him through his statements and the broader investigation. The 5 murders for which he was ultimately convicted were Hazel Scatolin and the 4 women killed in 1999. That distinction is not a technical footnote. It is the difference between what was alleged, what was investigated, what was confessed, and what was established in court. And in a story about real people, those distinctions matter. Because behind every allegation is a human life. Behind every investigation is a family. And behind every conviction is a legal process designed to determine what can actually be proven. Fife's eventual statements would add another layer of complexity. He admitted involvement in 9 killings, according to the case history. But even then, the broader number of victims associated with his name remained disputed. This creates an uncomfortable question for anyone trying to understand the case. When a person claims responsibility for crimes beyond those for which he is convicted, what should we believe? How do investigators verify a confession? How do they separate truth from exaggeration? Why would someone confess to a murder? Why would someone deny one? Why would someone claim responsibility for another? These are not simple questions. And they become even more complicated when the person making the statements has already been identified as a murderer. A confession can be powerful, but a confession is not automatically a complete map of reality. Investigators still have to compare it with evidence. They have to test details. They have to determine whether the person could actually know what they claim to know. And they have to establish which cases can withstand scrutiny. That process would take time. But the first step had already happened. Fife had been found. The man who had potentially been moving through the story for years was no longer an unidentified figure. The investigation could finally look directly at him. And yet, perhaps the most disturbing question was not what investigators would find. It was what they might have missed. Think about 1979. At that point, no one looking at the first suspected killings could have known what the next 20 years would bring. There was number 1999 yet. There was no pattern visible across 2 decades. There was no future arrest waiting at the end of a timeline. There was simply a murder. Then another. Then time. Years passed. The world changed. And somewhere inside that passage of time, more women would enter the story. This is where the case becomes difficult to understand through numbers alone. A timeline can make murder look almost mechanical. 1979, 1980, 1981, 1982, 1983. But human lives do not move in neat dates. Between those years were thousands of ordinary moments. Hazel Scatolin had a life before March 25, 1981. Louise Poupart-LeBlanc had a life before 1987. Pauline LaPlante had a life before 1989. Anna Yarnold had a life before October 1999. Monique Gaudreau had a life before the end of that month. Teresa Shanahan had a life before November. Mary Elizabeth Glenn had a life before December 15th. Those lives deserve to be remembered as more than entries in a murder timeline. They had routines, relationships, preferences, memories, people who knew their voices, people who expected to see them again. And then, suddenly, they did not. That is the human center of the story, not William Patrick Fife. The women, the families, the unanswered questions, the years of waiting. Fife would eventually receive a life sentence. But before the courtroom, before the verdict, before the legal conclusion, there was an investigation. And before the investigation, there were victims. To understand how investigators finally reached Fife, we have to understand the world in which these women lived. We have to slow down, step away from the police files, step away from the name of the accused, and look at the people whose lives existed before they became case numbers. Because every investigation begins at the moment a life is violently interrupted. And every true crime story risks making the same mistake if it starts with the killer and ends with the killer. The killer is only one part of the story. The victims are where the story begins. So before we follow the trail of William Patrick Fife any further, we need to go back. Back to the places where these women lived. Back to the years when none of them knew what was coming. Back to a time when the name William Patrick Fife meant nothing to the families whose lives would eventually become connected to his. And back to the first names on the timeline. Because long before the police understood the pattern, these women were not part of a pattern at all. They were simply living their lives. And that is what makes what happened to them so difficult to comprehend. The danger did not arrive with a warning. The future did not announce itself. There was no visible line separating an ordinary day from the last day of a person's life. For the victims, there was only life as they knew it, until suddenly there wasn't. And somewhere in that space between ordinary life and irreversible violence, the story of William Patrick Fife began. There is a moment in every long investigation when the past stops being the past. 4 years, an old murder can sit quietly inside a file. A photograph. A report. A name. A date. A few pages describing a life that ended violently. And then something happens. Another woman dies. Another crime scene appears. Another set of investigators begins asking questions. Suddenly, the old file is no longer alone. It has a companion. Then another. And another. The past begins to speak. That was a danger facing investigators in Quebec in 1999. They were not simply dealing with a new murder. They were beginning to confront the possibility that an older story had never really ended. It had only been waiting. For 20 years, the name of William Patrick Fife had existed outside the public understanding of the murders that would eventually be associated with him. If the later investigation was correct, the story had begun in the late 1970s. But the man who would eventually be convicted of 5 murders was not standing in front of investigators in 1979. There was no dramatic revelation, no immediate arrest that solved everything, no single piece of evidence that suddenly illuminated the entire timeline. Instead, the years accumulated. 1979 became 1980. 1980 became 1981. Then 1982. 1983. 1984. 1985. 1986. 1987. More time. More lives. More unanswered questions. By the time investigators reached the murders of 1999, the distance between the earliest suspected killings and the arrest was enormous. That distance is important because it changes the way we think about a serial murder investigation. We tend to imagine a straight line. Crime. 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 Arrest. But real investigations can look more like a scattered constellation. One point here. Another point years later. Another point in a different city. And no one knows whether they belong to the same constellation until someone finally steps back far enough to see the shape. In 1999, investigators were forced to step back. 4 women had been killed within a relatively short period. Anna Yarnold, Monique Gaudreau, Teresa Shanahan, Mary Elizabeth Glenn. The names were different. The communities were different. But the possibility of a common offender was becoming harder to dismiss. Then came the question that every investigator dreads. If these murders were connected, how far back did the connection go? Was this a new offender who had begun killing in 1999? Or had the offender been active before? And if he had been active before, how many cases had been misclassified as isolated murders? That question can change an entire investigation. An isolated murder asks, who killed this person? A suspected series asks, who else might have been killed by the same person? The second question is far more dangerous, because every answer can create another case, another family, another victim, another set of memories that investigators have to revisit, and sometimes another mistake that has to be confronted. Police investigations are carried out by human beings. Human beings work with the information available to them at the time. A murder committed in 1981 is investigated with the technology, assumptions, witnesses, and evidence available in 1981. Investigators cannot use the knowledge of 1999 to solve a case in 1981. They do not know what has not happened yet. That is the cruel advantage of hindsight. Once the entire story is known, earlier events can appear obvious. But they were not obvious to the people living through them. That distinction matters when looking back at the Fife case. The murders that later became connected to him did not arrive as one package. They came separately. And each time, investigators had to make decisions without knowing what the future held. That is why the year 1999 becomes the turning point. Something about the concentration of killings forced investigators to reconsider the possibility of a larger pattern. The murder of Mary Elizabeth Glenn on December 15th intensified that concern. She was the fourth woman killed in the sequence. And only 7 days later, Fife was arrested in Barrie. 7 days. For a case that would eventually reach backward across decades, that interval is striking. A week separated the final murder in the 1999 sequence from the arrest. But the arrest did not immediately answer the biggest question. It only gave investigators a person to investigate. Now they had to determine whether the suspicions surrounding him could survive scrutiny. They had to reconstruct his movements. They had to examine his possible connections to the victims. They had to revisit older cases. And they had to determine whether his name belonged anywhere inside those files. The investigation expanded. Different police forces became involved. Unsolved murders were reviewed. The old cases were no longer viewed entirely in isolation. And slowly, a disturbing possibility began to emerge. The 4 murders of 1999 might not have been the beginning. They might have been the latest chapter. The earlier names became important. Suzanne Marie Bernier, Nicole Raymond, Hazel Scatolin, Louise Poupart-LeBlanc, Pauline LaPlante. Each name represented a separate human tragedy. But once Fife's name entered the investigation, those cases could no longer be ignored. Some would remain allegations or confessions rather than convictions. That is the uncomfortable territory of historical murder investigations. There are cases where investigators believe they know what happened. There are cases where a suspect admits responsibility. There are cases where evidence supports the admission. And then there are cases where the legal record ultimately establishes guilt beyond the crimes for which the suspect is convicted. Those categories must remain separate. In Fife's case, 5 murders resulted in convictions. The broader investigation associated him with additional killings. He admitted involvement in 9 murders. But not every death connected to his name carried the same evidentiary or legal status. That means the true story is not simply a number. It is a question of certainty. What do we know? What did Fife say? What did investigators believe? What could prosecutors prove? And what remains unresolved? These questions are essential because true crime is not fiction. There is no obligation to make the story cleaner than reality. Reality is messy. Sometimes there are gaps. Sometimes there are contradictions. Sometimes there are questions that remain unanswered even after a conviction. And sometimes the most disturbing part of a case is not what we know. It is what we may never know. For the families of the victims, uncertainty can be its own form of suffering. Imagine hearing that investigators have arrested someone. For the first time in years, there is a face, a name, a person who may finally be responsible. There is relief. But there may also be another question. Is this really the person? And if he is, what happened? Why her? Why that day? Why did no one see it coming? What was the last thing she said? What was the last thing she saw? Those questions are often invisible in official case summaries. Police reports focus on evidence. Courts focus on admissible facts. Headlines focus on arrests and convictions. But families live with everything else. The empty chair. The unanswered telephone. The photograph that never gets replaced. The memory of a person before the crime. The realization that an ordinary day became the last day without anyone knowing it. That is why the story of William Patrick Fife cannot simply be told as the story of a killer. It must also be told as the story of the people whose lives were interrupted. And before we reach those lives in detail, there is one more question that hangs over the entire case. How does a man remain outside the center of suspicion for so long? How does a suspected killer move through 2 decades without the full pattern becoming visible? Part of the answer may lie in the structure of the crimes themselves. Different years. Different communities. Different victims. Different police jurisdictions. Different investigative circumstances. The distance between cases can become a shield. A murder in one place does not automatically activate every old murder in another. Unless investigators have a reason to connect them, each case can remain inside its own boundaries. And those boundaries can be powerful. A police department sees its case. Another department sees another. A family sees one victim. Another family sees another. Only later does someone ask whether all those stories might have a common author. That is the moment a cold case can come alive again. A detective opens an old file. A name appears. A date. A location. A method. A connection. Then another. The detective turns another page. And suddenly the old case looks different. Not because the facts have changed. Because the context has. That is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Fife investigation. The victims did not change. The crimes did not change. The past did not change. What changed was the ability to see the relationship between them. By late 1999, investigators had reason to look backward. And when they did, they found a history that reached much farther than the recent murders. The first suspected killings connected to Fife dated back to 1979. Hazel Scatterland's death followed in 1981. Then came other cases in the Laurentide region. Then, after years of separation, the killings of 1999. The timeline did not look like a single event. It looked like a long shadow. And that shadow raises another question. What kind of person could exist inside ordinary society for so long while carrying such a secret? That question is often where people begin searching for a monster. They look for some visible sign. A strange childhood. A violent personality. A history of obvious cruelty. A face that looks dangerous. Something. Anything. But real life rarely provides such convenient answers. A person can look ordinary, sound ordinary, work ordinary jobs, speak to neighbors, stand in a doorway, shake someone's hand, and still carry a hidden capacity for violence. That does not make every ordinary person suspicious. It makes the reality of hidden violence more frightening, because evil does not always arrive looking like evil. Sometimes it arrives disguised as routine, and routine is exactly what makes people vulnerable. We open the door because someone has a reason to be there. We trust a familiar explanation. We assume that tomorrow will resemble today. We do not live every moment as if a threat is waiting around the corner. Human beings cannot live that way, and the victims of this case were not foolish for trusting the world around them. They were living normal lives. The responsibility belongs to the person who chose to violate that trust. That is why the focus must remain on the offender's actions, not on what the victim supposedly should have done differently. The women whose names appear in this case did not cause what happened to them. They were not responsible for another person's decision to commit violence. Their lives were taken from them, and their families were forced to carry the consequences. As investigators continued their work after Fife's arrest, the story became larger. The investigation was no longer only about the most recent murder. It was about history. It was about the possibility that several unresolved cases were connected. It was about determining what could be proven. And it was about finding a measure of justice for women whose deaths had remained unanswered for years. Eventually, the investigation would lead to charges. Eventually, it would lead to court. Eventually, it would lead to a life sentence. But none of that had happened yet. Before the verdict, there was uncertainty. Before certainty, there was evidence. Before evidence, there were questions. And before the questions, there were victims. That is where we need to go next. Away from the police station. Away from the suspect. Away from the courtroom. Back to the women themselves. Because if we begin with the killer, we risk remembering the victims only as names attached to his crimes. They deserve more than that. They deserve to exist in the story before the violence. To be seen as people rather than case files. To be remembered for the fact that they lived, not simply because they died. And so, as we leave the darkness of the investigation behind for a moment, we return to a quieter world. A world before the headlines. Before the police tape. Before the questions. Before anyone knew the name William Patrick Fife would eventually become associated with these murders. The women were living their lives. The doors were still opening. The telephones were still ringing. The streets were still familiar. The days still looked ordinary. And somewhere inside that ordinary world, an extraordinary danger was moving unseen. The investigation would eventually expose it. But first, we need to understand the world that existed before the killings. We need to meet the women. We need to understand the lives that were interrupted. Because long before they became victims in a criminal investigation, they were someone else's mother, someone else's friend, someone else's neighbor, someone whose absence would leave a space that could never truly be filled. And that is where the next chapter begins. Before William Patrick Fife became a name associated with a string of murders, there was another Quebec. Not another province. Not another country. The same place. But a different time. A time before the digital world had transformed the way police investigated crime. A time before smartphones placed cameras in almost every pocket. A time when surveillance footage was far less pervasive, when information moved more slowly between jurisdictions, and when a murder investigation depended heavily on physical evidence, witness memory, police cooperation, and the painstaking comparison of case files. This was the world in which the first murders later connected to Fife took place. It matters because a criminal investigation is never conducted in a vacuum. The tools available to investigators shape what they can discover. The way police departments communicate shapes what connections they can make. The technology of a time shapes what can be preserved. And the passage of years can transform an unanswered murder from an active investigation into something that sits quietly inside an archive, waiting for someone to look at it again. The story of William Patrick Fife stretches across much of that transformation. It begins in 1979. At that time, Fife was a young man. He had been born in 1955 and grew up in Montreal. The city was not simply a backdrop to his life. It was part of the environment in which he learned to move, work, and interact with other people. Montreal was a large urban center with neighborhoods that could feel dramatically different from one another. Residential streets, apartment buildings, commercial areas, suburban communities, and more rural spaces beyond the city created a broad landscape through which an ordinary person could move without attracting attention. That ordinary quality is important, because when we look backward at a case involving a serial offender, it is tempting to imagine the landscape as if it were already marked by danger. But people living there in 1979 did not have the benefit of knowing what would happen 20 years later. They did not wake up each morning thinking about a man named William Patrick Fife. They were living their lives. They went to work. They visited family. They maintained their homes. They opened their doors to people they believed had legitimate reasons to be there. The world does not stop being ordinary simply because a terrible crime is taking place somewhere inside it. That contrast is one of the most important elements in understanding the Fife case. The murders would eventually form a disturbing timeline. But the timeline was invisible while it was being created. A killing in 1979 did not arrive with a label saying it would eventually be connected to events 20 years later. A murder in 1981 did not announce itself as part of a future pattern. A death in 1987 could not be interpreted with knowledge of 1989. And none of those cases could be understood through the events of 1999 because 1999 had not happened yet. This is what hindsight often hides. We know the ending. The investigators did not. The families did not. The victims certainly did not. For everyone living through those years, each murder was a separate catastrophe, a separate investigation, a separate question, a separate family waiting for answers. And this is where the geography of a case becomes significant. The murders eventually associated with Fife were not confined to one street. They were not all committed inside one building. They did not remain within a small circle of people who obviously knew one another. The names and locations stretch across parts of Quebec. Mont-Royal, Senneville, Saint-Agathe, Laval, Baie-d'Irf. Other locations enter the broader history through the cases attributed to Fife. To an investigator looking at one murder, that geographic spread could make a connection harder to see. But to an investigator looking backward from 1999, geography could become another piece of the puzzle. The distance between places was no longer simply distance. It became a question. Could the same person have traveled between them? Could his work or lifestyle have given him opportunities in different communities? Could the apparent separation between cases have helped keep them separate? Those questions would become increasingly important. Fife worked in repair and maintenance. That occupation deserves careful attention, not because there is anything inherently suspicious about such work, but because it could provide legitimate reasons for entering homes. A repairman can knock on a door without immediately appearing out of place. There can be a practical explanation for his presence, a task to perform, a problem to fix, a reason for someone to let him inside. That distinction between stranger and expected visitor can be critical. A complete stranger standing outside a home may attract suspicion. A person who appears to have a legitimate purpose can receive a very different response. This does not mean every person working in repair or maintenance is dangerous. Quite the opposite. Most people performing those jobs are simply doing honest work. But in a criminal investigation, investigators must examine how an offender may have used ordinary circumstances to create opportunities. That is part of understanding the method without blaming the victims. The victims were not wrong for trusting people who appeared to have legitimate reasons for being there. The responsibility lies with the person who exploited that trust. This distinction becomes especially important in cases involving attacks inside homes. A home is usually associated with control. You decide who enters. You decide when the door closes. You know the rooms. You know the sounds. You know where your belongings are. The outside world remains outside. But when someone gains access through deception or manipulation, that boundary can disappear. And when the victim believes the person at the door has a legitimate reason to be there, the danger may not become obvious until it is too late. This possibility would later become part of a disturbing picture investigators constructed around Fife. But in 1979, none of that was yet clear. There was only the beginning. The first murders later associated with Fife included Suzanne Marie Bernier and Nicole Raymond. Their deaths occurred in October and November of 1979. Those names now sit near the beginning of a timeline. But at the time, they were not the beginning of a known serial murder case. They were women whose lives had been violently ended. The significance of their place in the timeline would only become apparent years later. That is one of the strange properties of historical investigations. The importance of a crime can change without the crime itself changing. A file remains the same. The victim remains the same. The evidence remains whatever evidence survived. But the discovery of another crime can alter the meaning of the first. Suddenly, investigators can ask questions they could not have asked before. Was the offender acting alone? Was there a repeated method? Was the victim selection similar? Did the offender have access to the same kinds of places? Did the same geographical areas appear? Was there a connection between the victims? And perhaps the most important question, had this happened before? In a modern investigation, databases and electronic records can make comparison easier. But in the earlier decades of this case, connections depended much more heavily on human investigation. Police officers had to know what other departments were working on. Information had to be shared. Reports had to be reviewed. Evidence had to be preserved. A detective looking at one case might not immediately know that another detective hundreds of kilometers away was investigating something similar. Even when information existed, finding the connection could take time. And sometimes the connection was not found at all. This is why cold cases can remain cold for years. It is not necessarily because investigators stopped caring. Often the opposite is true. They may have exhausted the leads available to them. They may have interviewed the people they could identify. They may have followed evidence as far as it went. They may have had suspicions without enough proof. They may have had a theory but no way to establish it. And then the case waits. For the family, the waiting is different. There is no professional distance. No shift ending at 5 o'clock. No case file that can be closed for the evening. The victim's absence follows them home. The unanswered question follows them through birthdays and holidays. The murder remains part of the family's history, even when it disappears from public attention. That reality is particularly important when discussing the years between the early murders and the 1999 investigation. From the outside, those years can look like empty space. 1979, then 1981, then 1987, then 1989, then 1999. But there was nothing empty about them for the families. Each year contained ordinary life and continuing grief. A family could move forward while still carrying the absence of someone they loved. Children could grow up with a missing parent. Friends could grow older while remembering someone who never had the opportunity to do the same. The passage of time does not make a violent death less permanent. It simply makes the person living with it older. And while families lived with those unanswered questions, Quebec itself continued to change. The communities connected to the case continued to develop. People moved in and out. Homes changed owners. Neighborhoods changed. Technology advanced. Police methods evolved. But the old murders remained. That becomes particularly important when the story reaches Hazel Scatolin. On March 25, 1981, Hazel Scatolin, 52 years old, was found dead in her apartment in Mont Royal. She had been attacked with a knife. The location immediately creates an image that requires no embellishment. An apartment, a private space, a place where a person should have been able to feel secure. And yet the violence happened there. The murder of Hazel Scatolin would eventually become one of the 5 killings for which Fife was convicted. But in 1981, investigators did not have that knowledge. They had a homicide. They had a victim. They had a crime scene. And they had to begin the painstaking process of reconstructing what had happened. Who had entered the apartment? Who had been there before the killing? What relationships mattered? What movements could be established? What evidence could identify the person responsible? These are basic questions in a homicide investigation. But each one can become extraordinarily difficult when the offender has deliberately chosen a situation in which there are few witnesses. The absence of witnesses does not mean the absence of evidence, but it can mean the difference between knowing that a crime occurred and knowing who committed it. That gap is where many investigations become stuck. A body can establish that someone died violently. It does not automatically identify the person who caused the death. A weapon may be recovered. It does not automatically reveal who held it. A witness may remember seeing someone, but human memory is imperfect. A suspect may have an explanation. That explanation must be tested. Investigators must build the case piece by piece. And when the years pass, some pieces become harder to recover. This is one reason the later arrest of Fife mattered so much. Once investigators had a suspect who could potentially connect multiple cases, they could revisit the old evidence with a new question. Not simply, who killed Hazel Scatolin? But, was Hazel Scatolin one of several women killed by the same person? That question changes the investigation. It also changes how investigators interpret the suspect. A person who appears connected to one murder can become much more significant if another case contains a similar connection. Then another. And another. The evidence begins to accumulate, but the accumulation does not happen instantly. It happens slowly. A name appears in one file. A location appears in another. A statement raises a possibility. A piece of evidence supports or weakens it. Investigators compare. They eliminate. They reconsider. They return to old questions. That is what the investigation after Fife's arrest would eventually become. A long journey backward through time. But before the police could make that journey, the murders themselves had to happen. And after Hazel Scatterland's death came another long interval. 6 years later, in 1987, Louise Poupard LeBlanc was killed. 2 years after that, in 1989, Pauline LaPlante was killed. Both women would later be associated with Fife. Both were attacked with a knife. Both deaths became part of the broader story he eventually told investigators. But neither would become one of the 5 murders for which he was ultimately convicted. Again, the distinction matters. A true crime narrative often wants a clean line. Victim. Killer. Evidence. Conviction. But the real record is rarely that simple. Some cases can be proven. Some remain uncertain. Some are supported by statements, but lack the evidence necessary for a conviction. Some may be investigated extensively, but never reach a courtroom. And sometimes a suspect's own words create more questions than answers. Fife's later admissions would do exactly that. According to the case history, he eventually admitted involvement in 9 killings. That admission expanded the scope of the investigation dramatically. But it did not erase the need for proof. Instead, it forced investigators to ask whether the details of those admissions matched what was already known. Could Fife know information that had not been made public? Did his statements correspond to evidence? Could investigators place him in the relevant locations? Were there details that could be independently confirmed? The process of testing a confession is essential. A confession can be truthful. It can also be incomplete. It can contain errors. It can be exaggerated. It can be influenced by motives investigators may not immediately understand. That is why the legal record ultimately matters. Fife was convicted of 5 murders. Those convictions created a firm legal foundation. The broader claims remain part of the investigative history, but they should not be presented as though every suspected killing was legally established in the same way. For the families involved, however, the distinction between legal certainty and unanswered questions can be painful. A conviction may bring justice, but justice does not necessarily answer every question. It cannot reconstruct the final moments of a victim's life with perfect certainty. It cannot return the years that families spent without answers. It cannot restore the future that was taken. That is why the setting of this case is not simply Quebec. It is time itself. The years matter. The changing technology matters. The geography matters. The separation between police jurisdictions matters. And the ordinary nature of everyday life matters. Because the most frightening aspect of a long-running murder case is not necessarily that the offender lived in some dark corner of society. It is that he could move through an ordinary world. He could work. He could travel. He could speak with people. He could enter places without immediately appearing suspicious. And while everyone else continued living their ordinary lives, investigators were left trying to understand extraordinary violence. By the end of the 1980s, the story had already accumulated several names. But there was still no complete public understanding of a single pattern. Then the 1990s arrived. Technology changed. Communities changed. Police investigations changed. And eventually, in the autumn of 1999, the timeline began to accelerate. That acceleration would transform the case. For nearly 2 decades, the murders had been separated by years. Now women were dying within weeks of one another, and investigators could no longer afford to treat each death as though it existed in isolation. The landscape was changing. The old cases were about to be viewed through a new lens. The question was no longer whether the murders were connected. The question was how much of the past was connected. And somewhere inside that question was a man who had spent years moving through the same world as everyone else. William Patrick Fife. Before the police knew what his name would eventually mean, he was simply another person living in Quebec. Before the victims became names in a criminal case, they were living ordinary lives. Before the pattern became visible, there was only one murder at a time. That is how the story unfolded, not as one terrifying event, but as a series of moments separated by years, geography, and silence. Until 1999, until 4 women were killed, until investigators began comparing the cases, until the old files were opened again, and until the past finally began to resemble a pattern. To understand how the murders connected to William Patrick Fife remained separated for so long, it helps to look at the map. Not the map as investigators would eventually see it. Not a map covered in lines, circles, dates, and names. But the map as ordinary people experienced it. A place where one community ended and another began. Where a city could give way to quieter residential areas. Where the distance between two towns could make two murders appear unrelated. Where a person could travel for work without anyone thinking twice about it. The locations associated with the Fife investigation did not form a neat circle. They spread across different parts of Quebec: Mont-Royal, Senneville, Saint-Agathe, Laval, Baie-d'Urf, and beyond those locations were the older cases that would later be associated with Fife. For investigators looking backward from 1999, those locations became pieces on a much larger board. But for the people who lived there, they were simply home. That distinction is important. A crime map makes places look clinical. A dot on a map represents a murder. A second dot represents another. A line between them suggests movement. But no map can show what those places meant to the people who live there. A home is not just an address. A street is not just a location. A neighborhood is not simply a point on a police report. These are places where people build routines. They learn which stores are nearby. They recognize familiar faces. They know the sound of the street outside their window. They develop a sense of what feels normal. And when a murder occurs in one of those places, that sense of normality can change almost overnight. The physical location remains, but the meaning changes. A doorway becomes the place where a victim was last seen alive. A house becomes a crime scene. An ordinary street becomes associated with police vehicles and investigators. A neighborhood that once felt familiar acquires a memory that cannot easily be removed. This is one of the hidden consequences of homicide. The victim is not the only person affected. The family is affected. Friends are affected. Investigators are affected. And sometimes entire communities carry the memory of what happened. Yet in the Fife case, the geographic separation may also have helped conceal the broader pattern. If two murders occur in different jurisdictions, the first instinct is often to investigate them separately. That is logical. Police agencies are responsible for crimes within their areas. Investigators begin with the evidence immediately available to them. They identify the victim. They establish the circumstances of death. They search for witnesses. They examine relationships. They follow leads. Only when similarities emerge does the possibility of a wider connection become compelling. And sometimes those similarities do not appear until years later. That is exactly what makes the passage of time so significant. Consider the difference between looking at a murder in 1981 and looking at it in 1999. In 1981, investigators knew what had happened to Hazel Scatolin. They knew she had been found dead in her apartment in Mont-Royal. They knew she had been attacked with a knife. But they did not have the future. They did not know that, 18 years later, 4 women would be killed in a sequence that would bring the investigation back toward older cases. They could not know what Fife's name would eventually mean. The investigators of 1999 had something their predecessors did not have: hindsight. They could look backward. They could compare. They could ask whether a murder from years earlier shared characteristics with the more recent cases. They could examine the possibility that the offender had been active long before anyone understood the pattern. That does not mean solving the old cases became easy. Quite the opposite. The passage of time creates obstacles. Witnesses become difficult to locate. Memories become less precise. Records may be incomplete. Physical evidence may have deteriorated. People connected to the case may have moved away or died. Investigators who originally handled the case may no longer be available. The world surrounding the crime may have changed. But the old files still exist. And sometimes a new investigation gives them new relevance. That was the significance of 1999. The recent killings created urgency. The older killings created depth. Together, they raised the possibility of a much longer story. The first names on that story reached back to 1979. Suzanne Marie Bernier, Nicole Raymond, 2 women whose deaths were later associated with Fife. Then came Hazel Scatolin. Then, years later, Louise Poupart LeBlanc. Then Pauline LaPlante. The timeline had gaps, large gaps, and those gaps could easily make the cases look unrelated. A murderer who kills once may never kill again. A murderer who kills again years later may not look like the same offender. Different victims can create different investigative paths. Different communities can produce different witnesses. And different police departments can develop different theories. The result is a fragmented picture. Imagine trying to identify a person from several photographs when every photograph shows only a different part of the face. One picture shows the eyes, another shows the mouth, another shows the outline of the face. No single image is complete, but eventually, someone realizes that all the photographs belong to the same person. That is what a long investigation can feel like. The pieces exist. The problem is knowing they belong together. The geography of the Fife case contributed to that fragmentation. The communities connected to the murders were not identical. Laval is not Baie d'Urf. Senneville is not St. Agathe. Mont-Royal is not the same environment as the communities farther from Montreal. For investigators, those differences matter. For an offender who is willing and able to travel, they may not. A person whose work involves moving between locations can have access to different communities without necessarily appearing unusual. This is where Fife's employment history becomes relevant. He worked in repair and maintenance. Again, the occupation itself is completely ordinary. But from an investigative perspective, it offers a potential explanation for mobility and access. Someone arriving at a residence to repair something may have a legitimate reason to be there. The homeowner may not question the person's presence. The person may be invited inside. The interaction begins under the assumption that everything is normal. That assumption can be exploited. The important point is not that people should distrust every repair worker. It is that investigators studying a suspect must consider how ordinary circumstances may have created opportunities. Criminals often do not need extraordinary circumstances. They need opportunity. An opportunity can hide inside routine. A knock at the door. A request for access. A familiar explanation. A professional role. The danger is not visible because the situation itself appears normal. This is particularly important in understanding crimes involving women attacked in or around their homes. Home invasion carries a special psychological weight because it violates the boundary between public and private life. A stranger in the street is one thing. A stranger inside your home is another. The home is where people lower their guard, where they stop performing for the outside world, where they expect to be able to close the door and be safe. When that expectation is violated, the psychological damage can extend beyond the victim. Families can later struggle with the idea that the place where someone once felt safe became the place where they died. Even years later, a house can carry the memory of what happened inside it. For investigators, however, the house is also a source of evidence. Every room can contain information. Every object can become relevant. Every point of entry can raise questions. Who entered? How? When? Why? What did they touch? What did they leave behind? What did they take? What did they know? The answers are rarely obvious. And when the investigation takes place decades before the modern era of forensic technology, the available evidence may be much more limited than investigators would have today. This does not mean earlier investigators were careless. It means science evolves. Methods that are standard today may not have existed or may not have been routinely available decades ago. A case can therefore contain evidence that investigators at the time could not fully exploit. Years later, the same evidence may become valuable in ways nobody initially expected. That possibility is one reason cold cases can suddenly move after decades of silence. A new suspect, a new witness, a new forensic technique, a confession, or simply a detective willing to look at an old case from a different angle. In the Fife investigation, the arrest itself created an opportunity to revisit the past. Once investigators had him in custody, they could ask questions that had previously been impossible to answer. They could compare his statements with old cases. They could examine his movements. They could look at his connections. They could revisit cases that had remained unresolved. And they could search for similarities between victims. But before those questions could be answered, the investigators had to confront another problem. Victimology. Why these women? Why were they selected? What did they have in common? Were they chosen because of opportunity? Because of location? Because the offender encountered them through work? Or was there another reason? These questions are central to understanding serial offenders. But they are also dangerous when handled carelessly. A victim should never be treated as though she somehow invited violence by being in a particular place or trusting a particular person. Victimology is not about assigning blame. It is about understanding offender behavior. Investigators study victims because the offender's choices may reveal something about him. If several victims share a circumstance, that circumstance may tell investigators something about how the offender operated. The focus remains on the offender. In the Fife case, the broader investigation would eventually reveal a group of women whose deaths had occurred over a remarkably long period. The gaps between them are perhaps as striking as the killings themselves. 1979, 1980, 1981, 1982, then 1999. It is almost like looking at a clock that stops and starts. 2 murders. Then silence. Another murder. 6 years. Another. 2 years. Then 10 years. And finally, in 1999, for women within a matter of weeks. What changed? Was it 5 circumstances? Was it opportunity? Was it escalation? Was there a reason for the sudden concentration of murders? The available case history does not provide a definitive answer to every one of those questions. And that is important. A responsible true crime narrative should resist inventing a psychological explanation simply because it sounds compelling. We can examine patterns. We can discuss possibilities. But we cannot turn speculation into fact. What we know is that the murders associated with Fife were separated by long periods, followed by a cluster of killings in 1999. That cluster changed the investigation. Suddenly, there was urgency. 4 women had died, and one of the cases contained a particularly significant clue. Teresa Shanahan's bank card was used at an ATM, and investigators identified a person resembling Fife at the machine. That detail connected a physical person to a victim's financial activity. It was no longer simply a question of whether Fife could theoretically have been involved. There was a specific circumstance that investigators could examine. Where had he been? How did he come into possession of the card? What did the surveillance show? Could the person be identified? What other evidence supported the connection? One clue can be weak. Several independent clues can be powerful. The challenge is building that chain. By the time Mary Elizabeth Glenn was killed on December 15th, investigators were already dealing with a series. Her death became another piece, and the location, Baydierf, added another point to the map. Now the geography itself seemed to tell a story. The killings were not all happening in one isolated neighborhood. The suspected offender appeared capable of moving. That matters because movement can create distance between crimes. Distance can make a series harder to recognize. Imagine 2 murders occurring hundreds of kilometers apart. The first police department may see no reason to contact the second. The second may have no reason to examine the first. Unless the evidence creates a bridge. That bridge can be a method, a victim characteristic, a piece of property, a witness, a vehicle, a financial transaction, a statement, or, eventually, a suspect. In the Fife case, the suspect became the bridge. Once investigators began focusing on him, the map could be redrawn. Old locations were no longer isolated. They became potential points in a sequence. And that sequence raised a frightening possibility. Perhaps the killer had been traveling through these communities for years. Perhaps the apparent randomness was not random at all. Perhaps the victims were connected not to one another, but to the offender's opportunities. That would make the pattern much harder for the public to see. The victims did not need to know each other. They only needed to cross the same person's path. That possibility changes the way we understand vulnerability. People often imagine that a serial killer chooses victims according to a fixed type. Sometimes that happens. But in other cases, opportunity can be just as important. The victim may simply be accessible. The offender may have a reason to approach. The situation may create an opening, and the offender acts. This is one reason ordinary life becomes so important in the Fife story. Nothing about a normal day announces that it is about to become a crime scene. The victim does not know the significance of the person approaching. The neighbor does not know what is happening behind a closed door. The person driving down the street does not know that a tragedy is unfolding nearby. Life continues. And then suddenly it doesn't. That is the psychological tension at the heart of this case. The difference between ordinary and catastrophic can be only a few minutes. Yet for investigators, reconstructing those minutes can take years, sometimes decades. They must reconstruct the final known movements of a victim. Who saw her? Who spoke to her? Who entered? Who left? What happened inside the space between those two moments? And if the person responsible has already disappeared, investigators may be left with fragments. That is why the eventual arrest of Fife was so significant. It created an opportunity to turn fragments into questions. But it also created another problem. A suspect can lie. A suspect can minimize. A suspect can deny. A suspect can confess. A suspect can offer partial truths. Investigators cannot simply accept every statement. They must test it. They must compare it with evidence. They must determine which parts are credible. And in a case involving multiple murders over decades, every statement can open another door. The investigation would eventually become an enormous exercise in sorting those doors. Which ones led somewhere? Which ones led nowhere? Which ones contained evidence? Which ones contained claims that could not be independently established? The result would be a complicated historical record. 5 convictions. Additional murders associated with Fife. 9 killings he eventually admitted involvement in. And a broader number that remained disputed. The legal case would therefore be narrower than the entire story. But the narrower legal case was enough to establish something profound. Fife was convicted of 5 murders. He received a life sentence. The court had reached its judgment. But before that judgment, there was the long work of investigation. And before the investigation could become clear, the investigators needed to understand the people at the center of it. The victims. That is where the setting eventually leads us. The geography tells us where the crimes occurred. The timeline tells us when. The investigation tells us how the pieces were eventually connected. But none of those things tell us who the women were. And that is the part of a story that can disappear most easily. A murder case can reduce a person to a name. A name can become a date. A date can become a line in a timeline. And eventually, the person disappears beneath the case. We should not allow that to happen. Because the real beginning of every murder story is not the murder. It is the life that existed before it. The woman who woke up that morning. The plans she had. The people who expected to see her again. The ordinary things that mattered to her. The future that existed in front of her until someone took it away. Before investigators saw patterns, there were people. Before there were case files, there were lives. Before there was a suspect, there were victims. And as the investigation moved forward in 1999, those victims would become the key to understanding the man investigators were searching for. The names on the map would become more than locations. They would become reminders. Each one marking a life that ended. Each one representing a family left behind. Each one becoming part of a question that had survived the passage of years. And that question was no longer simply, who killed her? It had become, who was doing this? How long had he been doing it? And how many lives had already been changed before anyone understood the pattern? The answer would emerge slowly. But first, we have to stop looking at the map. We have to stop looking at the dates. We have to stop looking at the suspect. And we have to look at the women. Because behind every point on that map was a person. And before she became a victim, she was living a life that had nothing to do with William Patrick Fife. That is where the next chapter begins. By the end of the 1990s, the world in which the earlier murders had occurred was beginning to disappear. Not literally. The streets remained. The homes remained. The communities remained. But the way people experienced crime was changing. Technology was changing. Police investigations were changing. And most importantly for the case of William Patrick Fife, information was becoming easier to connect. For years, an unsolved murder could exist almost like an island. A file belonged to one investigation. A victim belonged to one family. A crime scene belonged to one jurisdiction. But a killer does not necessarily respect those boundaries. A person can cross a municipal line without knowing that he has crossed into another police department's territory. He can travel from one community to another. He can enter one home, then another years apart. The physical distance between crimes may be enormous, but to the person responsible, the distance may mean very little. For investigators, however, distance can create silence, and silence can last for years. That is why the events of 1999 were so important. Something about the murders that year forced investigators to look at the bigger picture. The timeline suddenly became compressed. Instead of years separating one death from another, there were only weeks. Instead of a single unresolved case, there were multiple women dead in different communities. And instead of asking whether an isolated murderer might still be unknown, investigators had to consider the possibility of a serial offender. The word itself carries enormous weight. Serial killer. Once investigators begin using that possibility, the entire investigation changes. Every similarity becomes relevant. Every old case becomes worth reviewing. Every connection must be tested. The question is no longer only what happened to the most recent victim. The question becomes whether the same person has been doing this before. That means the past suddenly becomes evidence. Old cases that had once seemed closed, dormant, or unrelated can be reopened. Names that had disappeared from daily police work return to the table. Investigators compare dates, locations, victims, circumstances, and sometimes they discover something they did not expect. A connection. The 1999 murders began with Anna Yarnold in Centerville. Then came Monique Gaudreau in St. Agathe. Then Teresa Shanahan in Laval. Then Mary Elizabeth Glenn in Bay d'Urf. For women. For communities. A pattern that was difficult to ignore. But even then, the investigators had to proceed carefully. A pattern is not proof. A resemblance between crimes does not automatically mean they were committed by the same person. The police had to establish connections through evidence. That process is often much slower than the public realizes. When people hear that investigators suspect a serial killer, they may imagine detectives suddenly understanding everything. In reality, the opposite can happen. The number of questions multiplies. Every new connection creates another avenue to investigate. If two murders are connected, both cases must be examined together. If a third is connected, the number of possible relationships increases. If an older case is added, investigators have to search years of history. And if the suspected offender has moved between communities, multiple police forces may need to coordinate. The investigation becomes larger. The files become thicker. The timeline becomes longer. And every assumption has to survive scrutiny. The case of Teresa Shanahan provided investigators with a particularly important lead. A person resembling Fife was seen at an ATM using Shanahan's bank card. That detail mattered because it potentially placed a specific individual in contact with something belonging to the victim. It created a bridge between a suspect and a dead woman. But even then, investigators needed to determine exactly what that bridge meant. Was the person actually Fife? How did he obtain the card? When had he acquired it? What did the transaction show? What other evidence existed? The questions were not academic. They were the difference between suspicion and proof. A murder investigation can survive uncertainty for a while. A courtroom cannot. Eventually, prosecutors must present evidence that establishes guilt to the required legal standard. That is why the path from suspicion to conviction is so long. It is also why the final legal record of Fife's crimes was narrower than the broader list of murders associated with his name. The investigation eventually linked him to more killings than the 5 for which he was convicted. Fife admitted involvement in 9 murders. But the legal system did not treat every one of those deaths in exactly the same way. Some became part of the broader investigative history. 5 became convictions. That distinction would remain important throughout the story. But in late 1999, investigators were not yet thinking about the final number. They were thinking about the next victim. Because if 4 women had been killed within a matter of weeks, there was no guarantee that the sequence had ended. That possibility creates a particular kind of pressure. A detective working a cold case can afford, in a limited sense, to think about history. A detective dealing with a possible active serial offender cannot. The question becomes immediate. Who is next? Where will he go? How does he choose? What opportunity is he looking for? And can he be stopped before another woman dies? The murder of Mary Elizabeth Glenn on December 15th intensified that pressure. She was killed in Baie d'Irf. Her death became the fourth murder in the 1999 sequence. At that point, investigators had more than a collection of individual tragedies. They had a developing pattern, and the pattern appeared to be moving. Different locations, different victims. A short period of time. The investigation needed to move faster. 7 days later, on December 22nd, William Patrick Fife was arrested in Barrie, Ontario. That arrest marked the beginning of a new phase. The search for an unknown killer had become an investigation centered on a named suspect. But that did not mean the investigators had solved the case. In some ways, the hardest part was beginning. An arrest answers one question. It does not answer all the others. It does not explain motive. It does not automatically establish every crime. It does not reveal how long the offender may have been active. It does not tell investigators which old cases should be reopened. And it certainly does not erase the uncertainty surrounding earlier murders. The arrest gave investigators a starting point. Now they could look at Fife's life, his work, his movements, his connections, his possible access to victims, and his history. The history would prove particularly important, because when investigators began looking backward, the timeline did not begin in October 1999. It reached back to 1979. That was 20 years earlier. 20 years of history. 20 years of unanswered questions. 20 years during which the victims' families had been forced to live without the full truth. The first names associated with the earlier period included Suzanne Marie Bernier and Nicole Raymond. Then Hazel Scatolin in 1981. Then Louise Pou Parleblanc in 1987. Then Pauline LaPlante in 1989. The pattern now looked different. What had once appeared as separate murders could be viewed through the possibility of one offender. But again, investigators could not simply draw a line between the names. They needed evidence. They needed to determine whether Fife's connection to each case could be independently supported, and that meant going back into history. Old files had to be reviewed. Old evidence had to be examined. Old questions had to be asked again. Sometimes a cold case investigation is not about discovering something entirely new. Sometimes it is about recognizing something that was already there, a detail that had been overlooked, a statement that had not been connected to another case, a person whose movements had not previously seemed important, a pattern that could not be seen because nobody knew to look for it. This is where hindsight becomes both useful and dangerous. Useful because investigators can now see the whole timeline. Dangerous because it can make earlier investigators appear as though they should have known what would happen next. They could not. In 1981, they did not know about 1999. In 1989, they did not know what was coming. They could only investigate the evidence in front of them. That is the reality of crime investigation. Every detective works inside a moment. The future is invisible. And when a case remains unsolved, the future may eventually provide the clue that was missing. For the families of the earlier victims, that future arrived decades later. But it arrived with mixed emotions. An arrest can bring hope. It can also reopen wounds. A family that has spent years learning to live with uncertainty may suddenly find the murder back in the news. The victim's name appears again. Old memories return. People who had not spoken about the case in years may suddenly be asked to remember. The possibility of justice can coexist with the pain of reliving the loss. That emotional complexity is often absent from the public narrative. News reports focus on the suspect. Police statements focus on the investigation. Court proceedings focus on evidence. But families experience something much more personal. For them, a cold case is never truly cold. It may disappear from newspapers. It may leave the police station's daily workload. It may stop being discussed publicly, but the victim remains missing from the family. The empty space remains. The questions remain. And when a suspect finally appears, everything can become immediate again. What happened? Why? Who knew? What did investigators find? Could the truth finally be established? For some families, the answer would eventually be yes. but there would still be uncertainty around the broader number of victims. Fife's own statements would expand the story beyond the 5 convictions. He eventually admitted involvement in 9 killings. Yet not every murder associated with him reached the same level of legal certainty. This creates an important boundary for the story. There is a difference between a murder for which someone is convicted and a murder that is merely attributed to them. There is also a difference between an allegation and a confession. And there is a difference between a confession and independently verified evidence. Those distinctions may make the story less simple, but they make it more truthful. And truth is more important than simplicity when the people involved are real. By the end of 1999, however, none of those distinctions had yet been fully resolved. Investigators were still assembling the picture. The arrest had opened a door. Behind that door were years of unanswered questions. The police now had the opportunity to look backward, but they also had to look forward. What would happen next? Would Fife speak? Would he deny involvement? Would he provide information? Would the evidence support what investigators suspected? Would old cases finally be solved? The answers would emerge over the months that followed. But before the courtroom, before the confessions, before the convictions, there was something investigators needed to understand first. The women. The victims. Their lives. Their routines. Their relationships. The circumstances that brought them into the same investigation despite living in different places in different years. Because the map could tell investigators where the crimes happened. The timeline could tell them when. The evidence could help explain how. But only the victims could remind everyone why the investigation mattered. A serial murder case can easily become a story about numbers. How many victims? How many years? How many murders? How many convictions? But numbers create distance. A number cannot show a family sitting in silence after receiving terrible news. A number cannot show a photograph held by someone who remembers the person before the crime. A number cannot explain what it means to lose someone and then spend years without knowing who was responsible. That is why the next part of the story must slow down. The investigation will wait. The suspect will wait. The courtroom will wait. For a moment, we need to leave the police files behind. Because before Anna Yarnold was a name in an investigation, she was a person. Before Monique Gaudreau became part of a sequence, she was living her own life. Before Teresa Shanahan's bank card became evidence, Teresa Shanahan was a woman with a life that extended far beyond the final weeks of 1999. Before Mary Elizabeth Glenn became the 4th woman killed that autumn and winter, she was simply Mary. And before Hazel Scatolin became one of 5 murder convictions against William Patrick Fife, she was Hazel Scatolin, 52 years old, living in Mont Royal. The same is true of the women whose deaths were later associated with Fife but did not result in convictions. Suzanne Marie Bernier, Nicole Raymond, Louise Poupart-LeBlanc, Pauline LaPlante. Their names matter because they existed before the investigation. They had lives before the case. And those lives deserve to be acknowledged separately from the man whose name later became attached to them. This is where the story must change pace. Until now, we have looked at the landscape, the years, the cities, the police jurisdictions, the technology, the gaps in time, the emerging pattern. Now we have to look at the people. Because a crime scene can tell investigators how a person died. A case file can tell them when. A courtroom can establish responsibility, but none of those things can fully describe who the victim was. That requires something else. Memory, family, history, the ordinary details of a life. And that is where we are going next. Back before the police tape, before the headlines, before the arrest, before the name William Patrick Fife became associated with a series of murders. We are going back to the women, not as victims, not as statistics, but as people. Because every one of them had a life that was already underway. Every one of them had a past. And every one of them had a future that someone took away. The investigation would eventually seek justice for those lives. But justice begins with remembering whom it was for.